This is Play-by-Playcast,
Is that faster than a Greyhound?
the podcast about play-by-play guys, for play-by-play guys, by, I'm told, a play-by-play guy.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
Now here's the host of Play-by-Playcast, Tom Bodette. Wait, the Motel 6 guy?
We'll leave the light on for you.
No, Joel Godet.
Joe Godet.
Joel
Joel?
with an L.
Okay, here's your host, Joel Godet.
Don't worry, nobody's listening anyway.
Hey, welcome back into the podcast. It is episode number 150 of Play-by-Playcast, the podcast about play-by-play broadcasters for play-by-play broadcasters, hosted by a play-by-play broadcaster, a professional development podcast that dives into the tips, tricks, experience, stories, process, and preparation of some of the biggest and best play-by-play announcers in the business. My name is Joel Godet. You can find the pod on social media at PXPcast. I'm on social media at Joel Godet, or email me, JGODETT, at bsu.edu. Saturday was a big day. First of all, it was the Kentucky Derby. And Larry Colmus has been a guest, by the way, on the podcast, the voice of the Kentucky Derby and the Triple Crown on NBC. You can find him, I believe he is episode number 101, if you want to scroll back through and listen to what it's like to broadcast a Kentucky Derby. It was also May 4th, so may the 4th be with you. Fun game that I've played as a broadcaster. And I know Kevin Brown did this because it was May the 4th with the Baltimore Orioles on Saturday as well. I don't know if anybody else out there does this, but it's just something that I've done for many years. Every time I have a baseball game on the Saturday of the Kentucky Derby, now that I'm in college, when I was in professional baseball and I was doing games still when, the Belmont Stakes and such were going on, it became more feasible then. But for college, it's pretty much just a derby thing. I write down in my scorebook as many names that I deem pertinent, or sometimes that are harder to get in. Names of Kentucky Derby horses, past and present. And I'll try to work them in over the course of the broadcast. And the trick is to do it without anybody really being able to pick up on that. It's just a fun way to make this broadcast different from every other broadcast. That's a weird Passover way of saying that. But it makes things interesting. Like, can I go through an entire broadcast and drop in maximum security and long-range toddy and tax and, oh goodness, who else was there? Win. Like, can I get all of these names in over the course of 9 innings? I think I got like 10 or 11. I had a really good day. Kevin Brown, if you go on his Twitter page, actually, he shows his list of Star Wars phrases for May the 4th be with you. And he actually wrote down what inning he got each of them in. And actually had predetermined, he was like, okay, this works if this happens. So be ready for that. I thought it was really interesting to see. Like, there was one about Chewbacca, like, bring it home, Chewie. Then it said, like, if Orioles score a run. Just fun ways to add something a little extra, like the game within the game for us as broadcasters. And someone at home may pick up on it, and then it becomes fun for them too. But for us, it's kind of our little secret. Hey, hit us up on social media. If you play any games like that, or if you do anything on the air that, hey, over the course of 140 games, breaks up a little bit of your monotony during baseball season, give us a shout, at PXPcast, at Joel Godet. I would love to hear some things that you guys do that are interesting or unique during the course of a long baseball season. But that was how I spent my Saturday when Ball State baseball took on Northern Illinois in DeKalb. All right, on to today's guest. It is Harry Donahue from Philadelphia. And Harry Donahue is an interesting guy because we haven't had someone like him on the podcast before in 150 episodes. He's the play-by-play voice of the Temple Owls, first for football, then for basketball. Before that was the play-by-play voice of the Philadelphia Stars in the USFL. But for the most part, he is known in Philadelphia as an anchor on KYW News Radio, KYW was very famous. KYW, News Radio 1060. It's like, I mean, if you're from southern Jersey or, eastern Pennsylvania, and you know that jingle. Harry Donahue is one of the hallmark voices until he recently retired on KYW. Sports guy, news guy. He was an anchor on the air on September 11th. You can actually find he was part of a panel talking about what covering that day was like in real time if you go search him on YouTube. And on top of that, actually did school closings too. He was the voice you tuned into in the mornings on KYW to find out if you had school. Back when, before the internet and even after it. But, you turn on the radio to figure out if there was a delay or a closing or what have you. So he's got such a well-rounded and multifaceted career. So certainly we're going to get to all of the play-by-play stuff we usually talk about on this podcast, but there's so many other things to dive into with Harry. And where we start is the simple question of, what does he consider himself as he looks back on his career? Is he a sports guy that did news? Is he a news guy that did sports? Is he a guy that did a little bit of both? Harry Donahue is our very interesting guest. And by the way, if for no other reason than the USFL stories, make sure you stick around to find out about what it's like to have your color analyst become a player for 3 minutes. It's the USFL, folks. We start there with Harry Donahue. Is he news? Is he sports? Is he a little bit of both? On episode number 150 of PXPcast.
I mean, I grew up in a different era when I was getting into the business. I remember one of my mentors told me that the best thing to be is the most versatile person you can be in terms of being able to handle yourself, whether it's on the news section or the sports section. I mean, sports was always part of my life growing up. And probably when I got into my professional career, I realized that, if I wanted to just dedicate my life to sports, it may not be the best route to take. By that, I mean, there were maybe more opportunities getting into the business from a news side, a hard news side, than just getting into it from sports. So that's what I pursued. And then when I landed a job at KYW in Philadelphia, which was an all news station, this is back in the 70s. It was a station that kind of was perfect for me because my boss at the time realized that I had a keen interest in sports. Sports was a big part of the format, even though it was an all news station, but we did sports twice an hour. So therefore, they allowed me to dabble both in sports and also hard news as a reporter and also as an anchor. So it was like the best of both worlds for me. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but that's how it began.
I know you said when you got the job at KYW, you couldn't believe it a little bit. Why was that?
Well, I was young. I was only, I actually started there as a part-timer. I had been working in another station, a music station, actually, doing music and news. Going back on it. It was one of those stations where you had to do everything. So that was good too, to, get my career started. When I got tipped in KYW, was looking for freelance part-time anchors. Went down, met with the news director, and they were the preeminent station in Philadelphia for years. I mean, ratings-wise, if you go up in the city, everybody knew KYW. It was just one of those things. They did a little sports at the time. They had the Phillies back in the 70s and early 80s, back in what we used to call the halcyon days of that franchise, when they were perennial in the playoffs, and then finally they won the World Series. So, we were the flagship station. I got to cover that team on a regular basis, including 1980, the playoff series with Houston, the World Series with the Royals. And it was a surprise to me, I guess, because I was so young, because I had grown up listening to KYW. And now here I was working there with what I thought were legends to me in the business.
It's kind of the lost art of the radio sports reporter, or the radio reporter in a lot of ways nowadays. What was it like to be a radio reporter of the Philadelphia Phillies and other teams of that time, and to be able to cover things like the World Series and Super Bowl trips and things of that nature?
Well, back in those days, in the 70s, print was still king. So whenever you were involved in covering, whether it be news conferences or post game conferences with players and managers, coaches, the print guys dominated, and I think that certainly has changed. Now it's a video oriented, visual oriented, TV oriented business, much more so than it was then. Radio always had its place, but there was a certain, I guess for want of a better term, pecking order when it came to, okay, these guys sort of like will have their questions asked first, and then everybody else will kind of follow in, okay? And maybe that's still true today, depending on the marketplace or the event you're covering, but it was very much so the case. I remember, this is a funny story, back in 1980, the Phillies went up to Montreal. This is the final weekend of the regular season. And Dallas Green, of course, was the manager. And they had to win 2 games in order to clinch the NL East and get into the playoffs. Montreal had a very good team. Phillies had a very good team. So the station, probably because, well, 2 things. I was working for the station, was the flagship radio station for the Phillies, but also it was a big deal. And they decided to send me up there to cover that series. So I went to Montreal. I'll never forget, the series began on a Friday night. And back in those days, there were maybe 4 or 5 reporters, newspaper guys, and they would always meet with Dallas Green in his office about 2 hours before the game. And I walked in there, and that was the first road game I had done all year. And I walked in, and there's Dallas holding court with guys from the Philadelphia Inquirer, Daily News, a couple of suburban newspapers. And I kind of like walked in and stood in the back, and he stopped to answering a question when he saw me. And he said, "Well, fellas, turn around. Look who's here. This must be a big event. What are you doing here, Donahue?" And I was embarrassed, first of all. I can't imagine maybe somebody today would say something like that. But it was almost like a recognition that, a radio guy's here. How about that? There were no TV guys there for that little session. And there I was, sort of a fish out of water, getting exposed by Dallas Green in front of these guys that, like I said, were used to having Dallas to himself.
Did he let you stay?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Dallas, well, I don't know how much you heard or recall Dallas. Dallas Green was bigger than any room, bigger than any stadium that he was ever in, especially when his teams were doing well. And he was the best interviewer, or interviewee, I should say, or one of the best that I ever covered, because whatever was on Dallas Green's mind, he told you about it. And, the legendary story, if you look it up, it's probably, if you Google Jason Stark and Dallas Green, Jason at the time was a beat writer, the Phillies beat writer for the Philadelphia Inquirer. And of course, he's gone on to a lot of bigger and better things, but a classic. And I was there that night too. It was in Philadelphia. It was early in the season. And Dallas, the Phillies were having a tough time hitting the ball to get the season started. And Jason, prefaced his question to Dallas saying, Dallas, we always say that pitchers have an advantage in spring training, and sooner or later, once the season starts, hitters catch up with them. That doesn't seem to be the case for our team this year. And Dallas stopped, looked straight at him. I'm going to use some profanity here, if you don't mind.
No, you're good.
And he stood, and there was about 10 guys in Dallas's office. This is after the Phillies lost like 8-0 or something. He said, "Fuck you, Jason." And Jason Stark, he didn't have a comeback. I mean, who has a comeback to that? That was Dallas's answer. after Jason had kind of like eased into the question. Fuck you, Jason. Next question.
Can I quote you on that?
Oh, yeah, you can quote me. There's only two. One of the two people involved is still alive, but I'm sure he doesn't forget it.
What kind of coverage would you be able to do from a radio standpoint back in that day as well? What kind of leeway? What kind of creativity? How did you approach things in terms of what you wanted to draw from it?
Well, I'll give you an idea. I remember it was, I forget the year, but it was probably well into the 80s. And I was doing some stuff. The Eagles were in a playoff game. And the flagship radio station for the Eagles back in those days, believe it or not, used to do about a 10-minute pregame show. And the game was like at 1 o'clock. They would come on at 12:45 or 12:50. And that was it. I mean, that's all they did. I mean, it's hard to believe because now pregame shows start at 8 o'clock in the morning, maybe earlier.
For a night game.
And last forever, right? But so I went to our program director. I said, listen, now this is a Sunday afternoon playoff game in Philadelphia. I said, how about if I come in at, say, I normally didn't work on weekends. I said, but I'll take over all the sport. We did sports twice an hour at 15 and 45 after the hour. I said, I'll come in and I'll dedicate 5 minutes from 15 to 20 after and from 45 to 50 after, leading up to getting kickoff of the Eagles game to just Eagles coverage. Forget everything else. And that had never been done before. And what I did was during the week, I made it a point to go down to practice every day after my regular shift and get as much tape as possible with coaches, players, so that I had plenty of material leading up. I basically did a 4-hour lead in, and we didn't have the games on our station. And then when it was 1 o'clock or 12:45, I hopped in my car, raced down to the stadium, got there a little after kickoff. I'll never forget. I was in line trying to get something to eat, I guess, at halftime in the press box, and there were a couple writers there, and I was standing behind them in line, and these were guys from out of town, and they were talking about the game and a couple things that had happened, and the one guy said, "Yeah, I was trying to listen driving to the stadium this morning, and the only thing I could pick up on the game was something on the all news station. I heard the guy talking. He didn't know who I was." And here I was in line, and they were saying, it was pretty interesting. He was talking to Vermeil about this or whatever. And I'm thinking, well, at least somebody was listening, But can you imagine? That's how. So, I tried to do things that nobody else was doing. And I remember one time being an Eagles practice in '80. That's the year they went to the Super Bowl and lost to Oakland. And it was during the regular season. And I wasn't at every practice or every game, but I used to go occasionally. And they practiced at what was then the old, because they were going to play a game on regular grass. And of course, Veterans Stadium was turf.
Yep.
So they practiced at the old municipal JFK Stadium, which used to be the host stadium for the Army-Navy game every year. And it was virtually in decay. The only time they used it for the last 20 years was for Army-Navy. But the Eagles, whenever I had a grass game, they would go over there that week in practice. And I never forget, I was kneeling on the sidelines in the pregame, and I had a tape recorder with me. And all of a sudden, Coach Vermeil himself, he didn't have an assistant or, some manager come over. He himself walked over. He said, "How you doing?" I said, "Good, Coach. How are you?" And they're doing their calisthenics. He said, "What do you got there in your hand?" And I had a little cassette recorder. And I said, "Oh, this is just my tape recorder." He said, "Is it on?" I said, "No, it's not on, Coach." He said, "Well, do me a favor." I said, "What?" He said, "Walk over there and give it to one of my trainers, and he's going to keep it for the whole practice. Unless you leave, then you can take it with you. But he said, I don't want you to have it with you while you're watching." Now, this wasn't a video camera. It was an audio cassette. And I never asked him why. I just did it. I mean, today that would probably become like a big event or something, But people would be sending out tweets on that. But I just said, "Okay, Coach." And I that's how, I don't want to say paranoid, but that's how paranoid some coaches could be. And you learn to deal with that, you know. I mean, today I'm sure it's still the same. But, like, you know, I don't know what he thought I could do with an audio recorder, but whatever it was, he wanted to make sure I couldn't do it.
You're going to record somebody's cadence or something of that nature?
Yeah, something like that. Or maybe, you know, hollering something at somebody to run a better, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. But that was one of the strangest requests I ever had from a coach.
When did play-by-play come into the picture? Like, what was the first game that you called?
First game I ever did as a professional announcer was the first game of the Philadelphia Stars of the United States Football League.
Okay, so what
March
got you?
March 6, 1983.
What made you say, like, when the Stars came around? What made you say, you know what, this is where I want to go, and I want to give this a crack? Then.
Okay, I was working at KYW. I had been there full time since 1978. So this was 83. This is 5 years later. The USFL began in 83. It was a springtime league. The first game was in March. And, you know, it was a whole new venture. And I had found out, you know, on the street that the Stars were looking for a play-by-play announcer. And I just figured, hey, let me give this a shot. So I knew Carl Pearson, who was formerly with the Eagles and had gone over to the Stars as the president. And I called him and asked if I would be, you know, could throw my hat into the ring to be the play-by-play announcer. And Carl said, well, let me get back to you, you know. And he said, did you ever meet Miles Tannenbaum? And I said, no. Miles Tannenbaum was one of the principal owners of the franchise. He said, well, why don't you give him a call and tell him what you want to do? I said, okay. So I called Miles Tannenbaum. Now, he was a businessman. He was a real estate investor, very successful, but a passionate football fan. He and his partners put up the money to buy the franchise. I called him. And I said, Miles, we've never met. He said, I know who you are. He said, I listen to you every morning. I said, good. Okay. I said, I want to be your play-by-play announcer. He said, well, what have you done in play-by-play? I said, well, let me be very honest with you. Professionally, I've never done play-by-play. I said, but since I was 10 years old, I used to sit in front of the TV, and I used to do play-by-play into a tape recorder. And I always dreamed of being a play-by-play announcer. And I said, let me tell you this, Mr. Tannenbaum. I said, you've listened to me on KYW. I said, I've kind of, you know, reached a certain status early in my life and my career working for the #1 station in Philadelphia. I know my limitations, and I would never put myself in a position to fail. By that, I mean, I'd never want to embarrass myself and ruin what I've achieved so far. That's exactly what I said to him. He said, you know what? I like that. I like that. He said, let me have somebody call you back. We'll set up an audition. I hung up. I got a call in 2 days. I had an audition. And this is about 2 weeks before the start of training camp. And training camp back then was only about 3 weeks before the season. So this is sometime in February, roughly 4 weeks away from the start of the league. And I got a call to go to a radio station, and they were going to set me up in front of a TV monitor, and I was going to call 1 quarter of action by myself, no color analyst. And all they would tell, I said, well, what game am I going to be doing? All they would say was, it's going to be a recent Super Bowl. And I'm thinking, okay. So what I did was I got videotape of the previous 4 Super Bowls. Okay. Somehow I got access to them. I put them in a machine at home. These are the old VHS tapes. And I sat for 2 days watching every play of the previous 4 Super Bowls, taking copious notes, okay? Memorizing as much as I could, rosters, plays, the whole deal. So I went to the station for the prearranged audition. I sat down in a room. The program director came in. He had a tape with him. He said, I got a first quarter of this game. We had a tape recorder set up. said, all we want you to do is act like you're doing the play-by-play for the Super Bowl. Okay? I said, fine. Okay. Boom. He puts the thing in. He walks out of the room, turns on my recorder. Up came the Super Bowl of that year. It was Washington, Miami. Joe Theismann was the quarterback for the Redskins. I couldn't believe it. I said, I have this game memorized to myself. It's like going into taking a test when you know the answers. I mean, I aced it. I had everything bang, bang, boom, because I had some notes, and from each game of the 4 that I watched. So I just pulled out the notes for that game, and off I went. And 15 minutes later, he came in. He said, okay, thanks. We'll get in touch with you. 2 days later, I get a call from the Stars, and they said, we'd like you to do our games. I said, great. How much are you going to pay me? $200 a game. I said, I'm in. And that was the beginning of my career. We opened up in Denver. My color analyst was Vince Papale, who went on to, of course, become the guy that they made a movie about, Invincible. And little side note, Vince called me when they were making the movie. Mark Wahlberg, of course, played him. They were looking for a play-by-play announcer, not an on-camera role, just off-camera doing some play-by-play at the end of the movie, and I got that job too. So that was quite a year, 1983, for me professionally, and it's one I'll never forget.
How cool was it to be in a Hollywood movie? Like, what's that process like? Or did you just have to record something and send it to them? How does that work?
Well, I was hooked up, thanks to Vince, with the producer-director. It was a Disney production. And, of course, I was in Philadelphia. They were in Burbank. And they said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to reserve time for you to go to a sound studio in Philly. You don't have to come out here. We'll do everything in Philadelphia. We'll hook up a conference call, and we'll direct you as you're doing it. So I went down to the studio. They had sent me a script. They had yet to send video. It wasn't finished. So I was basically on a 3-way hookup with the audio guy in Burbank, with the producer-director somewhere out there, Santa Monica or whatever, and me in Philadelphia. And I had copied it. They said, okay, you got the script? Yeah. Okay, read the first paragraph. I read it. Okay, can you do this a little different? All the direction was given over the phone. We spent now the whole script in terms of minutes and on what the final product was on the film. I don't know if you ever see it. It's at the very end. Is about maybe 5 minutes. Okay, where it's just me doing highlights of things that Vince supposedly was doing in his career with the Eagles. And I did, the first session took about 2.5, 3 hours. Okay. Then they said, look, we're going to bring you back. We got some more copy we want you to read. Can you be here whatever day? A couple of days later, I said, I'll be here. Went back for about an hour. All told, I made, I think, 4 visits to the sound studio, and the last couple were for a half hour or less, just to do a couple lines. And at a couple points, I even said, guys, look, do you mind if I make a suggestion copy-wise? They said, no, what do you want to do? I said, well, this line about, that's really not the way I would say it. Can I say this? And they said, yeah, we love that. So I never got a credit as a writer, but between me, you, and anybody else listening, I also had a chance to write a couple things over and do it my way.
And the royalties just flow in.
Yeah, I still get a royalty.
Do you really?
I mean, the deal I signed with them was like a one-time thing, but I also get a check approximately every 6 months.
That's wild.
Some of the checks are for the vast sums of like $18, $19. I don't know how Disney Productions does it. I guess it's a lot easier now in this digital age to keep track of stuff. But when you think of all the personnel
for every movie
who have been involved in Disney movies for whatever cause, and they're still paying guys like me, I can't believe it.
That is wild. And somebody's sitting there doing
that's a wild story.
That's got to be a good job to be the guy who figures out who gets $9 every 6 months.
It's probably just, it's based on on-demand views.
Sure.
In the beginning, they were a little bigger because, they were in hotel rooms and airplanes and so forth. But now it's, but it's still, it's the type of check where you put in a frame and don't cash it.
I have not read the book yet. It's now that it's summertime. It's on my list of things to do. But the Football for a Buck book that Jeff Pearlman wrote, kind of as a diary of the USFL. What are your memories of the USFL what's the most USFL thing you remember about the league and being involved with it?
Well, in Philadelphia, it was a unique situation because over the course of the 2 years they were in Philadelphia, and then, of course, the third year they went to Baltimore before the league collapsed. They had the best personnel of anybody, and they went to the championship game each year. They won twice. They lost to Michigan. Bobby Hebert, do you remember Bobby Hebert? Wound up playing with the Saints, ironically, for Jim Mora, who was the Stars coach. Michigan won the first year, Michigan Panthers, and then the Stars won the next 2 years. And they had, how can I say, there were a bunch of guys who were looking for a chance. Some of these guys were looking for a second or third chance, of course. But it was a mixed bag of ages, talent, and characters. And in Philadelphia, they really got lucky. And a lot of that was because of Carl Peterson, who I mentioned before, was a great personnel guy with the Eagles. There was a keen personnel guy with the Stars, and eventually went to the Kansas City Chiefs in the same role and had years out there with Lamar Hunt. But Jim Mora put together a great staff. I think, counting Mora, there were 3 other guys on that staff who became head coaches in the National Football League.
Oh, wow.
Dom Capers was one of them. Vince Tobin was one of them. And there's one other that I'm missing. And, of course, Jim was the head coach. He had here's another funny Pally story. Vince, by this time, was in his late 30s, but a great athlete. And he had played, 2 or 3 years with the Eagles, primarily on special teams. But his position was wide receiver. So he and I would go to the practices, and he'd always get in Moore's ear and say, "Jim, if you ever need anybody, I'm still in good shape. I can, guys down, I can help you out." And Jim would just smile and say, "Okay, Vince, I'll let you know." Well, don't you know, one day, the Stars, I had 3 or 4 wide receivers that were dinged up and couldn't practice. So Jim comes up to Vince and says, "Hey, Vince, you want to put it on today and go out there?" He said, "Oh, man, Coach, I'm ready, blah, blah, blah." So he goes in, he gets the pads on. This is a true story. Comes out. We're at Vet Stadium. That's where they practiced. And the quarterback was Chuck Fusina, who was a hell of a quarterback at Penn State, runner-up for the Heisman in the late, I think, 70s when he came out. In any event, Chuck was a very smart guy. Didn't have a real strong arm, but he was very accurate. But by his strong arm, I mean, he could stand 10 feet from a pane of glass and couldn't break it with his hardest throw. And he's on the sidelines warming up, and Vince goes out. And the players are kind of joking around. Here's Vince Papale. Now he's wearing a uniform. So Chuck says, "Hey, Vince, I'll throw a couple to you, All right, Chuck, So he throws a couple. Next thing you know, he throws one down around Vince's crotch, and it hit him right square where he lives, and down he went. I mean, like a ton of bricks. And and Chuck doesn't know what to do. He runs over to him. I ran over to him, and Vince was in excruciating pain to the extent they had to take him to the hospital. And here he had his scrotum swelled up, and here's poor Vince Papale, spent 3 minutes in pads and went down on a pass from weak-armed Chuck Fusina. I mean, it was probably the funniest thing I've ever seen in my career. That one of my partners came down on the injured list after 3 minutes on the sidelines. But That was a funny thing. My overall memories of the league were they had a lot of talent. That was a quarterback laden league. When you look at guys who came in, Jim Kelly, Doug Flutie, Steve Young, you name it. I mean, that league was loaded with talent. Herschel Walker, Philadelphia had Kelvin Bryant, who later played with Washington. I mean, they were Sam Mills, the late Sam Mills, undersized guy. I one time did a football game with Sam Rutigliano, who had been the head coach of the Browns when Sam came out of college. Sam was undrafted. He went to a small college, Monmouth, I think, up in North Jersey, and Division II or whatever. And he was 5'9". He weighed 210 pounds, a linebacker. Well, that's not going to cut it on the paper test, the eye test, when it comes to the NFL. But he was so good they couldn't cut him until the very end. And Rutigliano told me it's the worst personnel movie ever made. And it played out to be that way because Sam became an All-Pro with the Saints and Carolina. And, of course, he was an All-Pro or all at USFL for 3 years. And unfortunately died at a very young age of cancer. But probably the nicest guy I ever met was Sam Mills.
So if your play-by-play career starts in the USFL,
right.
What does it mean now for you to, for goodness, almost 30 years, be the voice of the Temple Owls?
Well, actually, how I got the Temple job was they had a new guy come in that year. I was working with the Stars the first year, new to Philadelphia, and he was in charge of broadcasting for Temple. Heard me doing games, called me, didn't know me, and said, "Hey, we're going to make a move and hire somebody. Would you be interested?" I said, "Sure," and that's how I got that job. In fact, my first color analyst with Temple was the great Herb Adderley, who was a Philly guy. Of course, had 4 Super Bowls, 2 with Green Bay, 2 with the Dallas Cowboys. He was breaking into broadcast. He didn't do much after that, but he wound up being one of my roommates and color analyst for my first couple of years at Temple. But doing games now, I mean, I take it for granted, but until the ball goes up or the kickoff, and then I realize, man, I'm living a dream. I mean, it's not network TV or NFL, but I get a hell of a lot of satisfaction from doing college football and basketball at a pretty high level, and being around people like John Chaney and Fran Dunphy and Bruce Arians when he was a young coach at Temple, and all through the years of players and characters, different stadiums and arenas. It's a pretty good life. I really love it, and I wouldn't still be doing it at the age of 70 unless that's how I felt about it.
One of our favorite questions on this podcast for people that work with coaches of that ilk. I guess you can apply this to anyone that you just mentioned, but I guess I meant it more in the vein of John Chaney. How did working with a guy like John Chaney make you a better reporter, question asker, play-by-play guy, person in your career?
I don't know if it helped me develop in terms of my performance on air, but it made me open my eyes to see a world out there that a lot of people don't see, because Coach had his hand on the pulse of everything. And a lot of John Chaney's practice time was spent not talking basketball, but talking life and decisions that his, as he called them, his young men were going to be faced with making. And, people have perceptions of John Chaney who probably never met him or spent any time with him. And all I would say to them, as I would say about anybody, but in particular, Coach, that before you make any prejudgments about, what you think he's like, walk a mile in his shoes and get him to tell you his stories. And I think you'd probably have a different impression. So that more than anything, I think that's what I learned from John Chaney. Coach had his ways. I mean, this was a different time. I started doing basketball in the 90s, late 90s. And we were not back in those days. Nobody had charter flights and all that stuff. So we would travel with the team, my analyst and producer. But as soon as we got to the airport where we were going, rather than get on the team bus, we would have the rental car, and then the rest of the trip, we provided our own transportation. We could never travel with the team because the coach had a rule: only players, managers, and coaches were allowed on the team bus. No announcers. So after about 3 games, 3 road trips, I said to my partner, John Baum, who was a great player at Temple and still does the games with me now for 20 years or so. I said, Johnny, did you ever ask Coach why he does this? Oh, no. He said, I know, that's Coach. I'm going to let him do it. He said, okay. I'm going to ask him. He said, okay. So one day we're sitting around. I don't know if it was a practice or what. I said, Coach, I got a question. I said, you have this rule about no announcers on the bus. And I'm just wondering, why is that? And without blinking an eye, he said, you know why? He said, because the only people on that bus are essentials, and you're a non-essential. And I just said, well, Coach, I'm glad I know where I stand. And we both had a pretty good laugh. But that was John Chaney in a nutshell. I mean, he would just let you have it, and it may not be what you wanted to hear, but that didn't stop him from saying it.
Did you ever take the bus by the end of the time you guys worked together?
No, that didn't change until he had retired, and Fran Dunphy came on, and Fran had no problems with us taking the bus. Yep, that stayed.
Did you?
That did not change.
How close did you ever feel like you were to getting to broadcast a Final Four?
Boy, well, it was back in those days. I'm trying to think the last time Temple I got to the Elite Eight. I didn't do the game that they the last Elite Eight, and then the last, I guess my first 5 years were John's last 5 years. He did not do well in terms of wins and losses. We didn't go to the NCAA tournament, in other words. So really, I never had any dreams of doing. Well, I had dreams, but realistically, a Final Four was a stretch.
Well, so let me flip that then, because you've been doing football for longer.
Oh yeah.
What's it like? Because you've had the best of both worlds in terms of broadcasting that team. They're obviously very good right now, but there was a very long spell there where they weren't. What was broadcasting that Temple team like, and how did you
had to be very
tell
creative.
that story?
You had to be creative and entertaining. There was a stretch of 4 or 5 years, maybe longer. I try not to remember, where I was probably the losingest play-by-play college football announcer in the country. I mean, we went through seasons of 1-11 a couple times. We had an offer. I mean, and we were in the Big East for some of those years when we were playing teams like Miami, Virginia Tech, teams that were playing for national championships. Okay. Michael Vick at Vatech, and Miami had Clinton Portis and God knows how many other first-round draft picks. I mean, it wasn't a level playing field. But having said that, you went into every game, and I know the players did too, that, hey, we got a chance to win this. You had to. I mean, it was the only way you could go week to week. I mean, you had to be as optimistic as possible. Was it difficult? Oh, believe me, it was difficult. But these kids practice every bit as hard as Miami and Virginia Tech and Syracuse and Pitt. They just didn't have the personnel, but they didn't quit. And as their announcer, I felt the same. I was going to give it my best effort as well. I saw some brutal games. I mean, one year we opened up, I think we lost like 59-0 the first game to Louisville, and then we lost close to that to Minnesota the next game out in Minneapolis. at the old dome that they played the Vikings at. And I'm like, are you kidding? We've given up like close to 120 points in 2 games and not scored. And yet we got 10 more games to do. You know how tough that is? But hey, you strap it on or whatever, and you get after it the next week. And coaches did it, players did it, and announcers did it. And that's how I approached it.
Last thing I have for you, and I'll end on this note, and it's not a play-by-play related question. It's more just a broad announcer question. How long have you sounded like this, and how much work went into your persona, your voice, your instrument?
Well, I guess I'd say I've sounded like this my entire life. I never had a voice lesson. I used to listen to games all the time. Radio was king when I grew up, in the 50s, and I would listen to play-by-play on the radio, because not all the games, kids today or people today wouldn't believe this, but I mean, not all games here in Philadelphia, the Phillies the Eagles games are all on, the road games are on TV, but the home games weren't. And you had to listen to the radio, and radio was king. Like I said earlier, how print was king, radio play-by-play was king back in those days. And my real hero in the day was a gentleman by the name of Bill Campbell, who was the king of Philadelphia play-by-play. At one time, he did the Eagles, the Phillies, and the Warriors / 76ers. After the Warriors left town, the Sixers came a couple of years later from Syracuse. He did all of them. He did every sport but hockey. And I later on in life got to know Bill very well. And in fact, we did a couple Temple games together, both football and basketball. And that was the highlight of my broadcast career, to be working with someone who was at the end of his career as my career was getting started, but somebody who I had tried to copy and listen to as a kid. And here I was sitting next to him doing games. That was like hero worship. And I had to pinch myself realizing what was happening.
Well, Harry, I'm sorry that Temple left the Mid-American Conference the year before I got to Ball State, so we haven't had the chance to cross paths and call the same game yet, but hopefully at some point our paths cross. I appreciate you for taking the time to stroll down memory lane a little bit and spend some time with us here.
Well, it's a pleasure anytime I get a chance just to kind of relive how far the journey's taken me. And lucky for me, it's not over yet, I don't think. And I'm pleased to be able to sit down and answer some questions and share a little bit of my experience.
Can people find you on social media or Twitter or track you down that way?
Yeah, I am. I'm on Twitter. It's at Harry, H-A-R-Y, Donna, D-O-N-A. And occasionally I'll drop a gem out there or a nugget or whatever for what it's worth.
Awesome. Harry, thank you. This will go up on Friday morning. It'll be this week's episode. And I mean, again, I appreciate everyone for taking the time to do this. So thanks for answering an email from a guy and strolling down through the past a bit.
Joel, it's been a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
That is Harry Donahue joining us here on episode number 150 of Play-by-Playcast. Harry is spelled with 2 R's, but his Twitter handle is with 1 R. At H-A-R-Y-D-O-N-A. At Harry Donna is the way to follow him on social media. You did hear that correctly when he said it just a couple of minutes ago here. But Harry Donahue, thanks as always to him for joining us and taking the walk down memory lane. Hey, Vince Papali is your color analyst. Throw your pads on and then take a football right, as Mauro Ranallo would call it, to the peninsula south of the border. That is a football professional career return that lasted all of about 4 seconds. But I'm actually really stoked. Football for a Buck has been on my reading list for a very long time, since Jeff Pearlman had that book come out within the last year, or it's been about a year, I guess. I've wanted to dive into that and haven't had the opportunity, so I'm excited to dive into some USFL history, and cool to get that firsthand from Harry's perspective. And, the John Chaney stuff is interesting.
I feel like from a budgetary standpoint, I didn't ask that question. Like, who paid for the rental car so that the radio guys could drive separate of the team? I feel like it might just be cheaper to have everybody ride on the bus. And, like, much respect to John Chaney, but it is kind of a punch to the gut when the basketball coach goes, yeah, you're not essential, so see you at the arena. Yay! Man won a lot of games, though. And, hey, outside of that, seems like they had a really good relationship. I just can't imagine. I mean, I'm in a bus league right now in the Mid-American Conference, so it's not like I would fly somewhere and then get a rental car. I can't imagine what it would be like having to just drive all over creation to do games here at Ball State. Everybody's in a little bit of a different situation. We all have our highs and lows and our pluses and minuses in each spot of our careers. Many thanks again to Harry Donahue for joining us this week. Until next week, when we'll have episode number 151 of the pod, my name is Joel Gadet, the bump music is Marshmallow, and we are out. See ya!
And that will do it from St. Louis, where the score is inconclusive.